and welcome to Booklist. I'm your host, Nancy Pearl, and my guest today is Michelle Adams, whose new book is The Containment, Detroit, the Supreme Court, and the Battle for Racial Justice in the North. Michelle, thank you so much for joining us. I know you have a busy schedule, and I just really wanted to talk to you about this book, which I found absolutely fascinating and frustrating, and it was just great. Let me just say that.
Taking the time to read it and for having me on your show.
Why did you want to write this particular book?
Well, I've never written a book before. This is my first book. And I'm a teacher. I'm a professor. I teach at law school, and I have taught the case about what the book is about, called Milliken versus Bradley, many, many times. And I became incredibly fascinated by it, almost obsessed, because that case took place in my hometown of Detroit. And I continued to read about it. And at some point, I recognized there was just an incredible story there. And that story had not been told. And it's one of these things where if you write the book that you want to read. And I wanted to read this book, so I wrote it. It's having a response with people. People are reaching out to me, and I'm tremendously proud of it.
We know a lot about Brown versus Board of Education, and then here is this lawsuit that perhaps people who haven't taken your law school class had never even heard of. By the time when the lawsuit was taking place, I was not living in Detroit. I think I was actually in Ann Arbor, but I didn't know anything about it, and it was a revelation to me.
Well, thank you for asking me that question. So let's take a step back, if
Yes.
we shall, and let's go back to 1970. And it's a period of time where there's a lot of interest in the Detroit School Board. And the school board, which had been for many years before that run by more conservative members, at this point becomes dominated by sort of a liberal group who are quite interested in integration. And so ultimately, there's a lot of backstory to this, but to keep it simple, the Detroit School Board ends up, for the first time in its history, mandating a limited integration plan that would have affected about half of the high schools in Detroit, the Detroit public high school system. And when this happens, essentially all hell breaks loose. And there's a tremendous amount of pushback. And ultimately, the state of Michigan passes a state statute that overturns the decision of the Detroit School Board. And the state statute says, you know what, basically, you want to have an integration plan? Sorry, you can't have it. And it's at that point that the Detroit branch of the NAACP gets interested in this, because they sort of feel like, wow, there's a state statute that says you can't have integration. That's effectively saying the same thing as mandating segregation, and that feels kind of Southern. And so they get interested and they get involved, and ultimately they sue. And they sue both local school authorities and state school authorities, because the state, of course, had tried to block the integration order. And it's this case that ultimately winds its way up into the Supreme Court, called Milliken versus Bradley, that is at the heart of this book. And so what happens in the case is that we end up getting the case. We have a long trial. It's 41 days long. And there's a federal district court judge who's the trial judge in the case. And he starts out being incredibly hostile to the NAACP's claims. He doesn't really believe that the school district is segregated in any way. He's just skeptical. He thinks that these guys are making it up. And the lawsuit quickly becomes much broader than just this question of the state overturning the Detroit School Board's limited integration plan. The lawsuit ends up being about sort of the fact that Detroit was running a separate and unequal school system. And so it becomes a very, very broad lawsuit that plays out in front of this judge's courtroom in downtown Detroit. It's 41 days. And what's really interesting about that lawsuit is that inside of a school lawsuit, a lawsuit that was basically saying the schools are segregated, the plaintiffs, the ones who brought the case, actually had a housing case. So there's a mini housing case within a school case. And the housing case really tried to explain why it was that Detroit looked the way it did. Why was there so much residential segregation in Detroit? And once they started having that conversation, it ends up being, in effect, that in this case, all of the ways in which Northern Jim Crow created and maintained was on trial in downtown Detroit. And so this judge, who once started out being incredibly skeptical, sort of the scales fall from his eyes, and he begins to understand that there's an intertwined set of governmental policies that create both school and residential segregation in the city of Detroit. And he basically rules that the NAACP wins the case. But that's just really the first part. The next question is, well, you win a case. It's called a finding of liability by lawyers. Then the question becomes, well, what's the remedy? What do you do to solve the problem? There's been a constitutional violation, just like in the South. The judge said that Brown was violated, just like in the South. And the question is, what do you do about it? And this judge, who had started out being so incredibly skeptical, says, well, we're going to have meaningful school desegregation in Detroit. And because of the characteristics of the city, because so many white folks had been leaving, he says that we're going to bring the suburban school districts into that remedy. And so this judge, who had been a big doubter, orders what would have been the largest metropolitan desegregation order in the history of the United States. It would have affected about 800,000 students over 50 separate school districts. And this ruling was actually upheld by the intermediate federal court, the one between the trial court and the Supreme Court. And the appellate court said, yeah, this seems like the appropriate remedy. The trial judge said this was mandated by Brown. We agree. Gets to the United States Supreme Court, 1974, and it gets overturned on a 5-4 decision. And so that is the heart of the story in my book. But what my book really tries to do is tell that story in a broad, kind of character-driven, narrative way. And I think that it's captured the attention of a lot of readers across the country.
Yeah, it is a page turner, and there are heroes who appear. Judge Roth, for one, who sort of grows into his understanding of the importance of the case. As I was reading the book and reading about the Supreme Court, which was decided, as you said, by one vote, and that was Judge Scalia, I believe.
Oh, no, Scalia's a little bit later. Right?
Oh, he was later. Okay.
Yeah, this is what's called the Burger Court. Justice Scalia doesn't.
Oh, the Burger. Okay.
Yeah.
I guess because it was, I think, correct me if I'm wrong, Judge Scalia, who talked about that it isn't segregation, it isn't housing segregation, it's racial imbalance.
So you're right, Nancy. The very beginning of the book begins in an oral argument in the United States Supreme Court that I had the good fortune of attending in 2006, 2007. It was a different case called Parents Involved. And by then, Justice Scalia was sitting on the bench. Mm-hmm. And it really I open it up in the Supreme Court to give the reader a sense of sort of being able to ask, well, sort of, how did we get here? How did we get here to the point where the Supreme Court is saying it can't, there's no such thing as segregation anymore, hard to determine what caused it, we don't know, those kinds of questions. And I think those are the similar kinds of questions that many people in the country are asked, would ask and sort of say, look at our neighborhoods, look at our schools. It's not really clear, particularly in the North, how that got created. And so I began in the Supreme Court, and then I work backwards. Mm-hmm. And I take the reader inside the oral argument. I take the reader inside what some of the members of the court are talking about in more recent times. And I also introduce the reader to sort of some of my background. And then we begin to sort of go back in time, and we go back to 1967.
And there were Black ministers, members of the Black community who were not pro-integration, who did want separate but equal schools.
Well, there's one of the first characters you meet is a Detroit's leading Black nationalist, a guy named Albert Clegg, who was a brilliant guy, and you sort of get to know him as you get to know all the characters in the book. And one of the ways that we kind of enter our story is Albert Clegg kind of going to the Detroit School Board and saying, you guys have been running a separate and unequal school system for as long as I can remember. And if you can't get it right, we can. Let's take the schools back and let's run them for the benefit of Black children. So it was Black schools for Black children. And so one of the things I try to do with him and with all the other characters in the book and I talked to my students about this the other day, is using a level of empathy, even if we don't agree. Ultimately, I didn't agree with his strategy, but I wanted to empathize with all of the characters because all of the characters in my book are Americans. All of the characters in my book bring something different, raise different questions, have different things to say, contributed to the story. And I want someone to be able to pick up this book and step into this world and see sort of how we got from point A to point B. And so the other piece of this, Nancy, is to say that some people think that the Black community is monolithic, and it's not, right? There were tons of different ways to think about how to achieve racial equality and many different kinds of discussions and disagreements and arguments, but you would expect that in a community that is diverse. And there's great sort of ideological and political diversity in the Black community. And I wanted to put that out there as well so that people can really step into this moment.
Why did you call the book The Containment?
Thank you for asking that. That is taken directly from the lawsuit. One of the things that they did at the trial court level, and we talk a lot in the book about the lawyers and the lawyers' choices, but in a way that I think is quite accessible, is they discovered through their research and through the trial that they put on every day in Judge Roth's courtroom that in fact what had happened in terms of the city of Detroit now, separate and apart from the schools, but that in fact there'd been a series of interlocking governmental policies that have been going on for a very long time that contained Black folks within certain sections of the city of Detroit. And so this notion of the containment was an important part of the case. And so one of the things they were trying to do, remember we talked about the idea of there being a housing case within a school case, is they were trying to show that Black folks weren't able to make real choices about where they were going to live. And so once the school board decided they were going to use a neighborhood school rule, they were essentially incorporating the underlying residential segregation into the schools. And so the containment was created by a bunch of different kinds of factors and characters and actors. It was racially restrictive covenants. It was intentionally racially segregated public housing. It was separate racial salespersons, brokers, and realtors associations. It was redlining. It was actions at many, many different levels of state and local government, creating basically a vice where Black folks couldn't choose freely where to live. And that helped to explain the neighborhoods. And then for Judge Roth, saw this every day in his courtroom, and he saw these maps, these census maps. So he had the 1940, 1950, 1960, and 1970 census maps. And what it showed is that Black folks were sort of living in the center portion of the city, and that every 10 years they'd break out of a little portion and they get recontained and break out and sort of spill over and they get contained yet again. And so containment is basically the shorthand for what they showed in the trial. But it's also a way to think about Northern Jim Crow more generally. That's one of the reasons why I think that this case and this book is so important, because it wasn't just like Detroit was this sort of unusual kind of one-off, particularly strange and awful place. Detroit was actually, as much as I love it, pretty, standard fare when it came to how it was that Black folks were living in the North. And what really happened was that we had a nationwide system of Jim Crow that had regional variations. And the regional variation was in Detroit, but it was in Chicago, and it was in Seattle, and it was in Los Angeles, and a whole lot of other areas as well.
When you think about what happened and what is continuing to happen since the lawsuit failed, you do end the book on a hopeful note.
I do.
If you were to go back and do a second edition of the book, would you change that hopeful note, or are you really still an optimist?
So my book is the story of a tragic lost opportunity that I think that we had as Americans to come together and to bring our children together, to be educated together, and to live together. And I think the question that our nation faces right now is whether we're going to have a truly functioning multiracial democracy. I finished the book last year. Obviously, it takes for the book manuscript to go into, it's got to go through production, editing, all that kind of stuff.
Yeah.
So I finished the book before the outcome of this election was known. But I have to say, I don't think I would change it. And the reason why I wouldn't change it is because I think that we all as Americans have to be hopeful and optimistic, and we've got to work towards that future. Ultimately, what my book asks is, what kind of society do we really want to have? And what are the preconditions for having that society? And I think, and I hope readers will come with me through this journey, is that the preconditions for having a truly functioning multiracial democracy are to educate our children from the earliest grades together across race and class, and that as they grow up together and learn from each other, we will dispel a lot of the hostility and negativity and stereotype and racism that we see today. And so part of the reason I think we have arrived at this moment is because we went in the wrong direction in 1974. And so it's upon us, all of us Americans, to move forward and to reclaim our democracy. So I am still optimistic that we can do that. And I look back on our ancestors and all the characters in the book and the folks who came before them who have handed the baton to us. And I think it is now on us to make that promise real.
One of the things your book does so well is point out how these issues are so interrelated. When you have the housing bill and the school bill, in effect, they were heading toward the same end, which was this multiracial, multi-ethnic functioning democracy. I think often what I see is that too many people think that you can fix one part of our society without addressing all the other needs. And I'm not sure that your book convinced me that there are enough people to face that issue.
Well, so here's the thing. I think each of us is only one person, and no one person can fix everything, but each of us can try to fix one thing. And so the great optimism that I brought to the book in terms of putting this much time and effort into doing the research, and the great sort of ambition I have, is to work the demand side. And when I say the demand side is, because you just said there may not be enough people. And so what I have trusted in is the idea that just as Judge Roth was able to be convinced by facts, that other folks will be able to do that too. And so I have provided, and I have done the thing that I wanted to do, and to use my skill and my talent to deliver a story and to deliver some history lessons, but in a really accessible but not dumbed down way at all.
Mm-hmm.
Try to create that demand, to try to stimulate more people to understand how incredibly important this is, and to say, listen, when I'm thinking about a good school, is it really possible to have a good school in this society in the 21st century that's entirely monolithic? Is that what a good school is? Don't we want to educate our children to be able to survive and to thrive in a society that has many different kinds of people in it? It's certainly the 3 Rs, and I'm very, very concerned about that and issues having to do with school finance and school funding. But it's also about being able to interchange, to understand, to have empathy, even if it's not agreement, to be able to move forward as one nation, even notwithstanding our differences that we have. And so I'm trying to work demand. I'm trying to stimulate that demand. And I think if each of us tries to do one thing that's within our power and our talent to do, then we will move towards a better future.
When I grew up in Detroit and attended the public schools, this was in the years before white flight. So I did go to an integrated school, and I do remember inviting a woman, a friend, Connie Smith, her name was, to sleep over, and her mother felt that because this was Detroit at that time, and even though we lived in an integrated neighborhood at that time, and Connie's mother came to my house because she was afraid that I had not told my parents that Connie was Black, and she wanted to protect her daughter. And of course, that was not not necessary in that particular case. But when I look back on my elementary school, I remember how wonderful, how integrated, how we did, it was just a wonderful experience. And I think reading your book and the possibilities that it raised just made me think about what we've lost and what those students who are now attending that elementary school that I went to, what they've lost in this whole kind of, when the case was turned down, when Milliken versus Bradley lost.
I think about it, and I talk about this in the book at many different points, and I think about desegregation as being a twofer, right? So for Black students, one of the things is that we've learned through sort of hard experience that green tends to follow white. And so in terms of resourcing schools, one of the main success stories that isn't as well appreciated is in the South, where desegregation, the experience that we had there during the height of the desegregation period, roughly from around 1968 through 1980 or so, you had tons of additional resources flowing into Black schools. And so you're getting both the resource allocation, because what we see is that school authorities that are required to engage in court-ordered desegregation have to basically now level schools up. And so you're getting additional resources that are flowing in. And that's one part of the twofer. The other part of the twofer is what you just talked about, which is the ability for students to come together from the youngest grades and to be able to break down some of the problems that we see today. And so that's why I've become so passionate about school desegregation, in part because I think people don't understand what a successful social policy it was, but also because it contains that other element that I think we haven't seen in other kinds of social policies that are associated with education, which is the ability to take us to the next place we need to go as Americans, respect to our.
Michelle, thank you so much for being on the show today and talking about your book. And it is an important and so readable. You know, I was a librarian for many years, and we would talk about nonfiction for the interested reader, and rather than, this is an academic, as opposed to an academic treatise. And your book is the perfect book for anyone who is interested in history, our history, the history of our country, and especially, as your subtitle says, the battle for racial justice in the North. So thank you for the book and being on the show.
Nancy, I can't thank you enough, and what you just said is music to my ears. That was exactly what I was trying to do, and I thank you for appreciating it.